Welcome to Island Novora. For this video we're going to transform this island into an unpredictable ecosystem filled with unexpected deaths, some brave adventures and so much more. The island will be split into 6 iconic areas, each handcrafted to suit the needs of our prehistoric dinosaurs. The island will first be populated by herbivores, so they can get familiar with their new home, only to drop in some of the most terrifying carnivores to keep these herbivores on their toes. The weak will fall and the strong will rise. Let's take a look at the key locations on our island that our dinosaurs will be living in. So first up we have Colossus Hollow, where giants can roam surrounded by equally impressive mountainscapes. We have Cascadia Falls, one of the most stunning vistas on the island. Down the river from Cascadia we've got Raptor's Run. This network of rivers provides not only some beautiful scenery, but a home for some of our more semi-aquatic species. Further down again we've got the Shadowleaf Forest. This dark, tucked away plethora of foliage provides an ideal hiding space and respite from the rest of the bustling island. We move over to the Ancora Plains. Plain in its name, but home to many of today's species, and shoulder to shoulder with the plains is the Blackmire Swamp, giving home to the more environmentally needy dinosaurs that want somewhere a little bit more swampy to survive. All of that's coming up, but first let's dive in and have a quick look at the first of our herbivorous species on the island. I hope you're all as excited as I am. There's going to be so many tales to tell, and you don't want to miss any of it. The first of our herbivores onto the island were the Archaeornithomimus, a gallimimus-like dinosaur that would populate more than any other herbivore on our island. Next to go in over on Raptor's Run was the Pachycephalosaurus. These guys straight away felt right at home. With access to everything they need, they didn't see the need to move. Over in Blackmire we had our Therizinosaurs, and these giants wasted no time in bringing extra life to the swamp, the little splashes following in its mother's footsteps. However, this wasn't where all of our Therizinos wanted to stay. But as for where they go, that's a story for later. Because joining the Pachycephalosaurs on Raptor's Run was the Myosaura. However, like the Therizinos, they wouldn't be here forever. And like many other of our herbivores so far, they also had produced their own young. They had found a nice little area in the trees where there was a pocket of shallow water. The young Myas could play, whilst the older ones could graze. And now we have our first residents of Colossus Hollow, the Triceratops. These majestic beasts looked right at home and very quickly started exploring their surroundings. And it wasn't long before their co-inhabitors, the Brachiosaurus, arrived. This incredible Goliath was the perfect addition to this corner of the island. Just simply watching this dinosaur meander around was honestly breathtaking. And then there was extra Brachiosaur life. They had clearly felt comfortable enough to start their own family here. The first batch of many. As the day closed off and without a danger in sight, they could all sleep easy. The next day saw the addition of the Psittacosaurs. These curious little guys would be the first addition to Cascadia Falls. And then over on the Ancora Plains was the Ankylosaurus. This brute walked around with a certain assurance, a confidence that was evident in his swagger. Some curious neighbours even came over to see who they were now sharing their home with. On Raptors Run, some baby Pachycephalosauruses were just popping out of their nest. With no predators, it was all very exciting. We even had our first Triceratops, who decided to leave Colossus Hollow and make his new home, the Raptors Run. The Maiasaurus slept peacefully on the bank of the river, and stegosaurs were added to Shadowleaf Forest. Probably the most famous dinosaur currently on the island, they wasted no time checking out their new home. By now, however, it was dark, and they'd have to wait until morning to truly see the beauty of the lake that they now called home. We also had another wandering adventurer. A Therizinosaur had wandered over to Ancora Plains with its child. We also added Drios, because who doesn't love Drios? While some dinosaurs were just getting settled, there was one Psittacosaurus that had already begun his own adventure. He decided that Cascadia wasn't the home for him, and he moved over to Ancora Plains. Some other migrating neighbours were the Triceratops that preferred Raptors Run to Colossus Hollow. The Herrerasaurus had been added to Shadowleaf Forest. They were now sharing with the Stegosaurus. However, in this weather, there wouldn't be much exploring today. In other areas of the island, life was already being created. Another group of young brachiosaurs were born. The Therizinosaurs had found a secluded pond at the bottom of Ancora Plains. This cosy little nook of the map was actually a good place to stay. Back in Blackmire, however, two Therizinos were fighting for dominance. The dinos couldn't decide where they wanted to be, and they were floating between Cascadia, Ancora Plains and the Blackmire swamps. As a new day came about, I decided it was time to let go of the Dimetrodons. However, rather than letting them go through the helicopter, I accidentally just let them go straight out of the habitat, and so we're just going to see where they end up. And then the Baryonyx was brought to Blackmire. The Therizinos were no longer the only inhabitants. Back over on Cascadia, the Psittacosaurs were enjoying their scenery all to themselves. For now, this was their own slice of paradise. And it didn't take the Baryonyx long to decide who was their top dog as well. This Theri decided he was far safer sitting back and watching his new neighbours settle in from a distance. That new neighbour, however, was already making himself at home. In fact, they all were. Meanwhile, over in the Shadowleaf Forest, the Stegos were fighting for dominance. They needed a pack leader, and this would decide who would get the important role. These 2 to 3 foot long Thagomisers were thrown around with incredible force, until eventually one Stego was forced to retreat. And meanwhile on Ancora Plains, the Therizino had wandered too far out of his swamp, and the Anki wasn't about to just share his land. Meanwhile, the peace inside Blackmire was already shattered, as the Theri and the Baryonyx had a turf war. And making the sensible decision, knowing he was outnumbered, to retreat. Meanwhile, back on Ancora Plains, the Theri and the Anki slept off their battle wounds, completely unaware that there was a new arrival about to shake up the island forever. Striding in with confidence, our new Carnotaurus wasted no time in exploring the area around him. The Carno was in on Raptor's run, but the nearest neighbours were the Pachycephalosaurs, and it didn't take them long to realise this newly found danger. With one of them running back to the family to warn them, a new predator was in town. Now, before the Carnos got too settled in, they also needed to decide who was the boss of the group. And whilst all of that was going down, things were starting to settle down in the swamps. There was a momentary peace, but peace nonetheless. And our Psittacosaurus friend, who we now name Taco, was still in Ancora Plains, with no intention on going home. But then, at the bottom of the Ancora Plains, we had our first fatality. The Anki had finally had enough of the wandering Therizino, and put an end to his journey on this island. However, whilst one life was leaving the island, another one was just entering. But then, back over on Raptor's run, I noticed the Carno had wasted no time and had already taken out one of the Pachycephalosaurs. This was a sign that the Carnos meant business. And any other herbivore in the area knew now to watch out for the new strange predator on Raptor's run. Meanwhile, our newest guest, the Spinosaurus, was settling into his new surroundings. Shadowleaf Forest would be their home, at least for now. However, when I went back to look at Ancora Plains, I was surprised to see that our Carno had already wandered all the way over from Raptor's Run to Ancora Plains, and it wasn't just one of them. Remember, we released those Dimetrodons, but one of them now had already made his way to Ancora Plains and killed a Deinonychus. These dinos now found themselves in a really tough situation. They had predators coming from all angles. The Barry was coming from Swamp, the Carno came from Raptor's Run, and the Dimetrodon came from Blackmire. And it wasn't just one Carno, there was now at least two, with a third on the way. The Psittacosaurus could only sit there and watch, as these strange, large new predators roamed, just a river's width away. As a new day rises, tensions on the island were rising as well. Carnivores had now been introduced to the island, and everyone was finding their place and looking for somewhere to call home, trying new territories and testing potential challenges. For the Deinonychus family, it was a late morning. Some lions were in order after a tough day yesterday. And they weren't about to just lie down and roll over either. A Carno came back down from Cascadia and was surprised to find he was challenged by a Deinonychus. Something about the audacity of this tiny little dinosaur challenging him unsettled something, and he decided to back off, at least for now. So we now had the Carnos, the Dinos, the Barry and a solo Dimetrodon sharing this void between all three areas. And surprisingly, at least for the time being, there appeared to be a sort of truce, a tolerance for one another. The Triceratops were exploring Raptor's Run, and even a Brachiosaurus had wandered from Colossus Hollow down to Raptor's Run. Our island now was teeming with life, and it seemed as if we had created a somewhat stable ecosystem. Which could only mean one thing. It was time for some more predators. This Anki tried to defend his land again, but the Carno was just too strong. They were now well and truly running wild on the Ancora plains. A Dino did wander over to try and get a look at some food, but these Carnos were not in the mood for sharing. Whilst there was dominance in Ancora plains, a new king had entered Colossus Hollow. And whilst the Tyrannosaurus Rex had just landed on the island, the Spino and the Suchomimus had finally clashed heads. The Spinosaurus saw Shadowleaf Forest as his own territory, and there was no room for a Suchomimus to share it with him. However, these two, they couldn't put their differences aside. And despite having a broken tooth, the Spino came back for round 2, and this time finished the job. As Bella marched into Colossus Hollow, the Brachys could only watch in horror. Something in their instincts sent fear through their bodies. This was a big unknown, and they had young to protect. You see, we sent in 2 Tyrannosaurus Rexes. One was Bella, who had made her way to the Brachys. The other Max, he had gone the other way, over towards Raptor's Run. The inhabitants of Raptor's Run would soon have a much larger problem to deal with than the Carnotaurus. Who had, by the way, started another fight, only this time with the Baryonyx. But outnumbered, he knew it was time to leave. The Carnos now were well and truly on herbivore population control. They hunted down a number of dinosaurs on the Ancora plains, Cascadia, and of course the Pachycephalosaurus of Raptor's Run. After watching the Brachys all night, Bella finally made her move. This fully grown Brachy was her target, and the others could only watch on in horror. And as it collapsed from its wounds, I could only imagine the feeling of the comfort blanket being whipped away from these ginormous and usually untouchable creatures. And over in Cascadia we had some new arrivals, the Utah raptor. The Carno and Barry met once more, but this time deciding that violence wasn't the answer. Back over on Shadowleaf, a Spino caught a wandering Dryo. He had gone too far from Ancora Plains, unaware of the dangers that lurked in the forest. And as I went back to check on Colossus Hollow, I somehow caught the end of this encounter where Bella knocked over one of the young Brackies. Max, on the other hand, he was still over in Cascadia. And down at the bottom of the Ancora Plains was none other than our very own Taco. This guy was well and truly living his own little adventure. Back on Cascadia, Max had noticed a wandering Pachycephalosaurus. The crushing force made light work of this Pachycephalosaurus. And whilst Max had caught himself some dinner, the dinos were trying to hunt themselves. The target was a baryonyx in the Ancora Plains. However, this was always going to be an ambitious meal, and with one dino dead, the other still carried on. However, it would only end in tragedy for the both of them. The Barry once again has come out victorious. The Sukos had now crossed over away from the dangers of the Spinos in Shadowleaf and over towards the bottom of Ancora. And suddenly, nowhere on the island felt safe. And since they went their separate ways, will Bella ever meet Max? For now, we don't know. I certainly think they know where each other are. And will the reign of the Carnos go unchecked? The bullying on Ancora Plains. Will this newly found confidence from the baryonyx give it a crown? Or will it be its very own undoing? And as for the herbivores, they now have to keep one eye open at all times. And standing still whilst you're being hunted is also not a clever move. The sun set on a day of bloodshed. The herbivores were no longer carefree and would always have to watch over their shoulder. Most carnivores now were sitting on full bellies, but that won't last forever. Back in Colossus, Bella has a very close encounter with a young brachiosaur. She could have very easily ended its life there and then, but for as long as she has food, she doesn't need to kill needlessly. However, when the body of the grown Brachiosaurus runs out, there will indeed be Brachiosaurus back on the menu. If you've enjoyed the first 7 days of this ecosystem on Isla Navora, then like and subscribe, as I have no doubt there are more stories to be told.